upcoming dramas, just head to bbc.co.uk/original British drama. And drama guaranteed now on BBC One with David Dimbleby.
Tonight we're in Middlesbrough on Teesside. Welcome to Question Time. And a welcome as always to you listening or viewing, and to our audience here and to our panel. Tonight, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Charles Kennedy, Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary and Election Coordinator, Douglas Alexander, the Conservative Housing and Planning Minister, Brandon Lewis, the Times columnist, Melanie Phillips, and the comedian Matt Forde, who calls himself an ardent supporter still of Tony Blair. And as ever, of course, you can join in this debate from now on by text or Twitter. Our hashtag BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time. Text comments to 83981, push the red button, and you'll see what others are saying. Our first question is from Sam Elliott, please. Sam Elliott.
Are the mainstream political parties in crisis?
A simple question. Are the mainstream political parties in crisis? Charles Kennedy.
Now, who was it that never said crisis, what crisis? No, I don't think they're in crisis, but I think that, certainly in my experience, which now is over 3 decades in the House of Commons, 6 months out from a general election, we've certainly never had a situation where all the 3 UK party leaders, Messrs Cameron, Clegg and Miliband, are not without their difficulties. Neither are their parties. And you've got the added cocktail in all of this. In England, you've got the escape valve, if you like, that's upsetting, or potentially can upset the apple cart quite significantly, called UKIP. You've got the potential across the UK for the Greens to put on support compared with where they've been previously. And as Douglas and myself know only too well, in Scotland, well, if you've seen the opinion polls there recently, you wouldn't have thought that referendum went the way it did in terms of maintaining the United Kingdom. Now, when you put all that together, 6 months out, this makes for a very unpredictable state of affairs as to what the outcome of the next general election is going to be, both in terms of the respective leaderships and the respective parties. And although I've never been great on psephology and statistics, that's not my kind of thing at all. Just my hunch, talking to people round the country and listening to people, is that we're looking probably next year at another general election outcome which doesn't deliver any one party an outright majority. What's your hunch, as you put it, about the Liberal Democrats state at the moment under their leader? Two things. One which I would have said, and in fact I think you did press me on this probably 4.5 years ago when the coalition was formed, that was going to make for a very hard passage for the Liberal Democrats. You were against the coalition? I didn't vote for it. You were against it? I did not vote for it. I think there is actually an honourable distinction. I stood up in front of all fellow parliamentarians and explained why I couldn't vote for it. And I don't need to go into all those reasons now. It having been democratically arrived at, it's in everybody's interest that the government of the country, particularly against the backdrop that was being inherited at that point, was seen to succeed. And I think in very many respects it has. But coming back to your question about the effect or the challenge for the Liberal Democrats, this was going to be very testing indeed, because an awful lot of people, left of centre voters, voting for us, would have been dismayed by the outcome. Had the arithmetic been different, a lot of centre-right voters would have been equally dismayed had that decision gone the other way, if the outcome had been different. So we were always going to be in difficulty, and what's added to it is obviously the fact that the Scottish dimension is now so volatile, so unpredictable, and proportionately for us, 60-ish MPs, 10 or 12 in Scotland, it's as significant in terms of what impact it can have on us as it is for Ed Miliband, Douglas and so on, for what it can have in Labour in a UK sense. So it's not a crisis, but it's a challenge unlike any we've seen before. All right. Right. Well, let's turn to Labour, Douglas Alexander. Your leader is apparently less popular than Nick Clegg.
and you're behind the SNP in your beloved Scotland, which may mean you're denied number 10. There's been attacks on him this very day. Is your mainstream party in crisis? Or is it all tickety-boo?
Well, no, I'm not saying it's all tickety-boo for any political party right now. I wouldn't believe that for a moment, given we're 7 years after the worst financial crisis in a century that's seen living standards fall across the country. This is going to be the first Parliament where people are worse off at the end of the Parliament than at the beginning. So it's hardly surprising that people feel angry. But I don't think it's just a sense of economic dislocation, real though that is. I think we as politicians need to be honest. There's also a sense of deep political alienation. And if you look back to the middle of the 20th century, about 90% of the vote went to the two main parties. That's been in long-term decline in Britain for a number of years. So how do we respond? I think, first of all, by being honest about the challenges that we face. I think part of the anger at politicians today is not just the aftermath of the terrible expenses crisis. It's the sense not just that politicians were overprivileged, but also the deep knowledge amongst the public that politicians are often underpowered to affect the forces that most directly affect citizens' lives. And in that sense, I think the party that will prevail in the general election in 6 months' time will be the party that can most convincingly capture the sentiment for change. Because what is ubiquitous in Scotland, in England, in every part of this country, is a desire for change to move on from the sense of pessimism and anxiety that people fear today. And that's the task that Labour set itself in the coming months.
But are you worried that your leader has slipped so far and continues apparently to fall in public esteem, that he's fallen behind Nick Clegg and has had these attacks mounted today? You've seen what the New Statesman, which supported him when he became leader, now says about him, that he's out of touch, doesn't understand lower middle class life, doesn't understand the people of Essex. And you've read the stuff.
But honestly, I think Ed probably was the first British political leader to understand the depth of the change that the financial crisis brought to British politics. Now, he's got challenges, but all of us have got challenges in every political party, and every one of us in the Labour Party has to reflect the reality that divided parties lose elections. And I feel we have got a profound responsibility to the people who want to get away from the mistakes, the errors, just the sheer injustice of this coalition government, to pull together to offer credible change in the face of these tough economic times. And that's exactly what we plan to do.
Let's hear from one or two members of our audience. You sit up there.
Isn't it time part of the solution could be if government and other parties started listening to people on the street rather than to career politicians? Listen to working class people. Working class people who feel they've not got a voice and they're not being listened to. Go back to them, and that's where the change will come from, and the country will get better after that.
Brandon Lewis.
Well, I think actually coming back to Sam's initial question as well, I think to an extent I agree with Charles. I think it's actually a real challenge for all of us in politics, in the sense, and that's a good thing. I think that's the beauty of living in a democracy, is it does mean it gives everybody a chance for us to, as politicians, to remember what we're here for. It's to actually take our country forward, to make sure we're given a really good sense of direction where the country's going, to outline what we're doing, why we're doing it. You know, under this coalition government, we've delivered nearly 2 million new jobs. That's more financial security for people. But it is about listening to people. You know, in my surgeries every week in my constituency, meeting people, talking about what they really care about, whether that is immigration, whether it is about making sure that they've got a job for themselves and their family in the future.
So no disillusion, no crisis.
Well, no, I think there is a real challenge for us to make sure that we are engaging with people directly, but I think that's about making sure we're dealing with the issues that people care about and showing people that there is a way forward. And actually, the best times for our country are ahead of us. And I think there's a lot of work to do. Over the last 4 years, people have had to put up with this government having to deal with fixing the broken economic situation we dealt with. We're doing that. We're creating the jobs. We've got new businesses coming in, and we're cutting taxes. That's only the start, though. There's still a long way to go, and that's what we've got to make the case to people about next year.
And the victory in Rochester will prove your point.
Well, we'll certainly be working very hard to get a victory in Rochester, but that's up to the people in Rochester. That's the beauty of a democracy.
OK, the man there in blue.
Would the solution to this current political crisis not to be to change the voting system to a more proportional system? First past the post only promotes regionalism and division in the country. If you look at Scotland, it's a solid north and the north, it's a solid Labour vote, whereas the south is strong Conservative. This just promotes division
Leaving
between
aside
north
that,
and
do you think that politics itself, the parties themselves, are in crisis, which was the question?
I think the reason the parties are in crisis is because there's a climate of political apathy. People don't relate with Miliband, they don't relate with Cameron, they don't relate with Clegg. This is the reason that Farage is so popular, and on the left is why the Green Party is so popular.
Matt Forde.
I agree with you, actually, but I think there's two key points I would make. Firstly, I think, oddly, politics has been a victim of its own success. Years ago, there was a far deeper ideological divide, and the future of the nation would rest really at quite a significant crossroads. That isn't where most people in this country are now. Most of us are broadly grouped around the mainstream centre. Politics has listened to the people and has come closer to us, and as a result, it's more collegiate. Sadly, it's more boring. The reason why Farage, and I absolutely agree with you, is more popular is because it is the style and the tone in which politics is conducted these days that alienates people. All this sort of body language, just the generic, empty phrases, Farage cuts through that, and that's the one single lesson all party leaders can learn from him.
How well do you think Ed Miliband is doing?
Not well at all, and I think partly it is a style thing, although I think Ed Miliband's a good man and I think he cares about this country. I think he suffers, not from a wonkishness, but from a professional, political... You know, whenever he's asked a question saying, look, if what you're asking me is what's the future for this country, then I'll simply say to you, we need to make a fairer society. You know, you don't get anywhere with answers like that. You want someone who tells it like it is. My issue with Ed Miliband actually wasn't a presentational one, it was one of policy. I thought his stance on Syria and the way that he treated David Cameron and reneging on the agreement to vote with the government on military action in Syria was a disgrace. And as someone who's a natural Labour Party supporter, I don't know what's left-wing about letting people in the Middle East be ruled by tyrants and having Britain walk by on the other side of the road.
You, sir.
Yeah, I don't think that the three main parties do think that their leaders and their parties are in crisis because they all wear rose-tinted glasses. If they actually took them off and listened to the public, they'd realise that all of their policies are so similar and that no one likes them. And this is why UKIP are on the march, and UKIP are going to trounce Rochester and Stroud in a couple of weeks' time.
Melanie Phillips.
I think this gentleman has hit the nail on the head. I think the problem is really quite fundamental. I don't think it's to do with the financial crisis. I think it is a fundamental alienation from politics for two main reasons. First of all, the politicians of the three main parties have been in a kind of collusion over many years to talk to an agenda which is not the agenda of ordinary people. And so the things that really, really matter to ordinary people somehow never get talked about. That's the first thing.
What kind of things?
Well, things like immigration and things like Europe, to name but two. The second thing, which is related, is the complete collapse of trust, because everyone can see that the leaders of all mainstream parties spout empty promises all the time. It's always, you know, jam tomorrow. And even when they tell us that they're telling us hard truths, you start counting your spoons, don't you? Because you know that they're not telling you the truth at all. It's all to do with calculation. And the reason for that, it seems to me, is that, and this is not just a problem in Britain, it's a problem in the Western world. There's a complete absence of leadership. By which I mean, if a leader actually believes something as a set of principles and has the moral courage to stand by those principles even though they make him or her very unpopular, then you trust that person to mean what that person says. We can all see that all the leaders of the mainstream parties have not done that. They go to the focus groups. They say to the focus groups, what would you like us to give you? And the focus groups say, jam today, tomorrow and yesterday, please. And they get up and they say, you know what? We're going to have jam tomorrow. And then, amazingly, it doesn't happen. And everyone can see that they have just said what is expedient. There is no principle. It is all opportunist. And I think that is the point. If we had leaders, a leader, who actually had the moral courage to say, this is what I believe, I really do think we are facing these complexities. I cannot promise you this and that. I am telling you what needs to be done. And if one can see that that is actually coming out of principle, that that is itself not an artificially confected, hard truth to win votes, then I think it would be a different matter.
Nigel Farage, is that? Nigel Farage? Who's
Nigel
your man?
Farage. What?
Well, I'm just asking who your person is.
I don't have a person.
You don't? Douglas Alexander, briefly, I'll come to you.
Let me be honest with you, Melanie. I think the divisive, exploitative politics represented by Nigel Farage is a politics that I disagree with profoundly. The kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Europe, stop the world, I want to get off politics, is selling a lie. And the truth is, politics at its best is about finding shared solutions to shared problems. And it's easy to pour cynicism on anybody who has chosen to serve communities across the United Kingdom, but there is a fundamental difference between a politics that seeks simply to amplify understandable grievances that people feel and trying to find solutions that actually allow us to work together and move our country forward. And you may find that disagreeable, but I disagree fundamentally, not just with Nigel Farage, but what his politics represents. It is a false prospectus for this country, and that is why we've got to oppose it.
I just want to say I think it's astounding that the Labour Party still sticks to Ed Miliband, and even though the opinion polls show that he's even lower polling than Nick Clegg, I'm just thinking, why are you still standing by this man? Is it that the Labour Party is trying to defy the term, you can't polish a turd? Because it just doesn't seem to be working for you.
Melanie's just criticised politicians for being blown around by public opinion, and you've then said politicians are somehow contemptuous because they're not following public opinion. The truth is, leadership involves saying, what kind of society do we want? Do we want actually to have an £8 minimum wage? Do we want an energy price freeze? Those aren't policies you hear from Brandon this evening. There are still fundamental differences between the political parties, and ultimately people will make their choice at the general election in terms of which vision of the country's future they're going to vote for.
I don't think anyone knows where they actually stand with Ed Miliband, and I think that's one of the problems. I think you've got people that's actually going, did you actually vote for the wrong brother?
David's in New York now. Who do you think would be a better Labour leader than Ed Miliband? Because that's the problem.
Yeah, you've got Chuka Umana.
Yeah. Alan Johnson would be fantastic.
OK. But you, just before we leave, you haven't talked about Ed Miliband except in general terms. I mean, you had this week your own shadow deputy leader saying we're in a dreadful position. The electorate looks as has no idea what our policies are. I mean, you are under attack. You've got problems in Scotland. You've got problems.
I don't take any comfort in acknowledging this, but I asked about that after Prime Minister's questions. It turned out he was talking about the Scottish Labour Party. So in that sense, even David Cameron didn't get that right.
Oh, right.
But listen, of course,
so you do have the problems in Scotland.
We have real challenges in Scotland. Of course we do. And the truth is,
could you be denied number 10?
Let me answer the question,
all right,
and then you can decide if you want to ask me another question. In terms of Scotland, it was 6 weeks ago that we had a referendum which gave the lie to the idea there is political apathy. 85% of us as Scots voted. Why did we vote? Because there was a massive, clear choice. In that sense, it exploded the myth that somehow all politicians are the same, or somehow that voting doesn't make a difference. Now, I think there is a lesson, not just for Labour, but for all political parties there, which is we need to paint this coming general election in primary colours, have very clear choices available to people about the difference that the respective parties will make. And in that sense, this idea that it's somehow voter apathy, that politicians should blame the public for not voting, the responsibility rests on political parties, including on Ed and myself, to set out that case in the months ahead.
OK. The woman there on the gangway.
I'd like to reply to Melanie Phillips. As one of the non-politician members of the panel, she talks about the ordinary person being concerned about Europe and immigration. I don't think the ordinary person is concerned about Europe and immigration. Most people are concerned about the NHS, jobs and education.
All right, so you have a different agenda. All right, do you want to come in? Can I come to you? Yeah, Forde.
I agree. I mean, people are concerned about a variety of different things at any one point, and you're right to say that those things are higher up the list than Europe and immigration. But the reason why UKIP are thriving, the reason why UKIP are doing so well, and the reason why people think that UKIP are the only people talking about those particular things is because when we try to have a mainstream discussion about immigration in this country, and people might remember it when William Hague gave a famous speech in his first term, his only term as Tory leader, people said, well, this guy's a racist, we branded him as xenophobic. And those of us on the left actually created the climate for UKIP by depriving a mainstream voice to be anti-immigration, which is perfectly legitimate. We created this monster, and this is why UKIP now feels like it's saying something that no one else is.
Yeah.
I think, you know, we're having this discussion in the UK in a week in which President Obama has just suffered a very severe political setback. And I don't know about all of you, ladies and gentlemen, but I'd have voted for him first time around and I'd have voted for him second time around. But his problem is not fundamentally different or unique compared with the problems of political leaders in our country or in France. They changed their presidency. Doesn't seem to have changed the political climate very much for the new one, and so on. We've had a global economic recession. The Eurozone, which impacts upon us, although we're not in the Euro, might yet be heading for yet another recession, which is going to have a huge impact on us if it happens. I hope it doesn't. And politicians across the spectrum, across the world, this jam tomorrow point that Melanie mentions, yes, we do come into politics to want to do things to make the world a better place, but that usually involves spending money. And when the money has dried up internationally, it's very hard for democratic leaders and politicians to deliver. And that creates the conditions where, frankly, reactionary, and I would argue slightly off-the-wall politics, like UKIP, begin to not just fester, but actually begin to prosper. And we've got, as mainstream politicians, to take that one head-on. So you've got to offer hope. And if you don't offer hope in politics, frankly, you may as well lock the door, throw away the key. You've got to offer hope, but at the same time, you've got to be honest with people. And I think if you treat people as adults, they respond as adults.
You want a brief point, and then we're going to go on.
Sure. I mean, actually, to an extent, I take Douglas's point around people sticking by their principles, and I hope Labour will stick by their principles and stick by Ed Miliband for a bit longer, certainly from my point of view. But I think, actually, there will be a very big difference come the general election. I think there is a real difference between the parties now. You know, if we're looking at Labour, we're talking about the two Eds who were advisors to Gordon Brown that got us into this mess, against David Cameron and George Osborne, who have taken us out of the problems we had, growing our economy. I think that's the place I want to be. And actually the job for us, actually all of us as politicians, when we come into a general election, is to outline to people what we aspire to in the future, to excite people to vote because of the positive things we can do. And actually the fact that the country is having these discussions, I agree with Matt actually, it indicates actually there is an appetite for politics in this country, and we should be applauding that.
All right. Let's... We'll go on to another question, but we'll stick with politics and stick with one of the key issues that was mentioned a moment ago. It's a question from Paul Everest. Please, Mr Everest.
How does the panel see the UK in 50 years' time with immigration the way it's coming? 250,000 a year are coming into the UK. It is changing our society.
How do you think the UK will look in 50 years' time if immigration stays at around the current level? Melanie Phillips.
Well, if it stays around the current level, it's going to look very different. But I think it's looking very different now. I mean, I think that there was a policy under the previous Labour administration to change the makeup of the country, to become a multicultural society. I think that was an ideological perspective that was put into practice for two reasons. First of all, because it was thought that it was better to be multicultural, that you would kind of break down bigotry and prejudice. And secondly, because it was thought that it was economically, it made economic sense. And I personally think both of those judgments were unwise, because no one ever asked the British people if they wanted their national identity to be changed. And you can't get something more fundamental than national identity. What worries me about immigration is this, and I speak as the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of immigrants who came to Britain around the turn of the 20th century. So I know better than anybody, really, or better than most people, that the many people that immigrants bring a great deal to a country and should be welcomed. But it has to be in proportion, it has to be sensibly managed. Because if you have the right number of immigrants coming in from cultures which are very different, you can assimilate them and accommodate them perfectly reasonably, and they add a great deal to a society. But if you take in too many too quickly, from too many cultures which are very different, not apart from anything else, if they don't have English as a first language, you can very quickly overwhelm public services. which can't cope, the health services, doctors, the schools. Schools can't cope with all the languages being spoken, and so on and so forth. And you also make it very difficult for the host society to assimilate them to become British, which I think is terribly important.
Okay.
Because if you have too many coming in, then you lose the sense of we all share in a national project.
And you apply this to immigration from within the European Union as much as from outside?
Well, it's simply a question of numbers. It's simply a question of too many people. I mean, we are a very overcrowded island, and our public services, quite obviously, I mean, obviously in particular areas, some areas are particularly in difficulties and others are in less difficulty. But it's quite clear to me that if you take in too many people, as we have done too quickly, you simply overwhelm public services wherever they come from.
You, sir.
Can I touch on a point Charles said? Charles, you said about politics offering hope to the people. None of you three parties offer me any hope, and you haven't for years. UKIP represent my views now. UKIP represent my views now. And why does David Cameron keep kidding us that he's going to do a deal with the EU on immigration? Merkel's come out and said it. They've all come out and said it. We're not stupid. We're not stupid. It's a new time. Whether you believe in UKIP or not, I'm so glad and I thank God that UKIP have stirred all you parties up. Because if they hadn't have, I don't know what you'd be... You wouldn't be looking us in the face and thinking there's a problem. You're just in your cosy little worlds.
I feel...
Hold on. Now, Dr. Alexander, Melanie started by saying it was a Labour deliberate policy to increase immigration. And you've just heard what the gentleman there said. What's your view?
I don't agree, frankly, with Melanie's characterisation, but we've been very explicit and open in saying that mistakes were made. We did underestimate the number of people who would come in after Eastern Europe joined the European Union, and Ed Miliband's been very explicit about that. To take the longer view of the question, I'll be honest with you, I think immigration has, over the centuries, brought immense benefits to our country. Nobel Prize winners, Olympic medalists, founders of some of our greatest companies. And it will continue to be important to our country in the 21st century.
On the scale that the question... On the scale the questioner mentioned, which was 250,000 net immigrants.
Well, frankly, I don't think that you can predict now over the next 50 years what net flows of migration are going to be. But as I was coming on to say, because immigration has been important, and whatever any politician says will continue to be important, it has to be fair. And that means it needs to be managed properly. And I think part of the reason there is such discontent and anxiety is because people don't feel that the right steps are being taken, or frankly were taken under the last government. We've got a situation today where there's 175,000 people here in Britain here illegally. That's not fair and that's not right, and it's understandable that people are concerned about immigration when that's happened. There are more pressures on public services in some part of the country than in other parts of the country. That's an issue that needs to be looked at. The issue of integration that Melanie mentioned, I think, is fundamental. If you're a public servant working in Britain, facing the public, you should be able to speak English. So in that sense, I think the right way forward to recognise the reality of the 21st century is to have proper controls, to have managed migration, and that's the kind of steps I think our government needs to take.
Okay. And within the EU, you accept that nothing can be done?
No, I don't accept that at all. That's
you think
part
you can
of
cut the numbers down from the EU?
Let's look at some of the steps that you can take. You can make it necessary for people to make a contribution to the benefit system here in Britain before they take from the benefit system in Britain. You can stop employment agencies, as I heard in Rochester this week, hiring people from elsewhere in the European Union for wages significantly below that being paid to British workers. There are practical steps that other European countries, incidentally including Germany, will support. The tragedy at the moment is the Prime Minister's not making that case.
Somebody shouted out from a woman's voice, I heard. Yes, go on then. Wait a second. Okay.
That isn't cutting the numbers, though, is it?
Well, there are factors that bring people to Britain, and if you say, for example, with the benefit system, we're not going to make sure that you are able to claim work-related benefits shortly after coming to the United Kingdom, that would have an effect.
Well, David Cameron has proven it this week. As long as we remain in the EU, we have no say over the amount of people who can come.
All right. The man behind you with spectacles in the third row, you, sir. Third row from the back, yes.
Given that it's emerged this week that EU immigrants have put in £5 billion more than they've taken out of the UK economy, does this not show... Does this not show that the UKIP bluster about anti-immigration is nothing more than scaremongering?
I agree with what you say, but I think some factors are more than economical. I think there are genuine tensions caused by some immigrant communities, by a failure to integrate, and these are real. And I'm coming from a position where I completely agree with you. There are issues about people not learning the language. There are issues of trust where we feel like people aren't entering into the British way of life. But the biggest problem I have isn't that we allowed immigrants to come in because I support it, is that we absolutely failed to defend it, to allow such a big change to happen to our society and to have a government at the time in Tony Blair, that I'm a big supporter of, failed to make the case, because the reason why UKIP is thriving now, one of the reasons is, we've been buried under a deluge in this country of anti-EU propaganda, anti-immigrant propaganda, and the reality is, you asked where we'll be in 50 years' time, the original question, I think the only way we're going to get the deficit down is if we continue to have the sort of immigration that we've had for the last 10.
OK. Brandon Lewis.
Well, I do think, actually, we have to be very balanced about this. I actually think there is a huge advantage from the immigration and the migration we have in this country. But as politicians, we have to represent the people who elect us, and we have to remember that. And there is a concern out there, and that's why I do think it's important that we have the changes we've had with welfare to make it less attractive for people to come here if they're not contributing. But most of the people who come to this country come here to work. And one of the things is our success. We've created almost 2 million jobs over the last 4 years. That's more than pretty much the rest of Europe put together. 3/4 of those have gone to British nationals, I have to say, as well. I think it's important to remember that. But in terms of, actually, the gentleman's point early on, in terms of what can David Cameron deliver, well, I would say judge somebody by what they've done and what they've shown they can do. David Cameron is the Prime Minister who used the veto. He's the Prime Minister who got us out of the bailout and got the budget cut in Europe. I think he will get the renegotiation we want to see. And when we talk about Angela Merkel, actually, if you look at the entire quote, what Angela Merkel said, as Douglas said, she also did recognise there are issues with the problems that they have got in Germany. And one of the key things with migration is it's migration of labour. And people who come here to contribute to our society, who learn English and integrate, are a real asset to us. And I think we've got to be really upfront about that.
What did she mean when she said we have the basic principle of free movement? We won't meddle with that, Angela Merkel. What did that mean?
Well, I
if
think
it didn't mean you can't meddle with it.
I think you've also got to look at the rest of the sentence, where she talks about, and we have got problems. She also talks, and actually the free movement within Europe is about free movement of labour. And I think when you look at it in that context, where people coming here to contribute, and let's remember, there are people from Britain, in my constituency, in the energy industry, taking their skills and expertise overseas as well.
Are you saying it's the free movement of labour, not the free movement of people, that is enshrined in the EU? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's the free movement of labour that we have to remember. It's labour. It's about people coming here to contribute to our economy and be part of our communities.
Well, what about all the people who go and live in Spain in retirement? They're not movement of labour, and that's under the EU.
No, and that's the point I'm making. This is not a one-way thing. We've got roughly 2 million British nationals who are living overseas as well. This is not a one-way...
I thought you were saying that only people who came here to work would be allowed in under the EU regulations.
No, what I'm saying is people who come here and contribute to our society can benefit from our society. So if we look at the welfare system, the changes we're making means that people cannot come here to go on the benefit system. And I think it's quite right that if people move from Britain overseas, they shouldn't in those countries either.
Charles Kennedy.
The irony in all of this is, of course, the biggest champion of the single market, and she did a great deal to advance it, was one Mrs. Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister. How ironic is that? And that, you know, that's a little fact of history, that there's quite a few folk, very vocal in British politics, that would rather not talk about or people didn't remember. That's point one. Point two, I do not agree with Melanie's viewpoint, that somehow a multicultural society, which is what we've become, and I welcome that fact. I happen to think we're a much richer, more diverse, better society precisely because we are multicultural, and I feel that as a Scot living within the UK, I feel that as a Highlander living within Scotland. I know about all these various levels of identity, and I think that is an immense benefit to us as peoples living within the United Kingdom. It's not a political project, it's the natural outcome of people coming from other countries and contributing to ours. And the point the gentleman made is absolutely correct. This most recent report simply confirmed what's been the case for decades, that there is a net financial benefit to our country by having people coming. The gentleman who supports UKIP, who said they offer the best hope and is shouting rubbish, I'm afraid, sir, your hopes are going to be sorely dashed by UKIP. I wish that to be...
can have your go. Why is Mr. Kennedy talking rubbish?
Well, I didn't shout that, but he actually
Oh,
is.
I see.
He actually
but
is.
he actually is.
There was two reports
Well,
out.
two.
There was two reports out. That's one that said there was a net benefit to the Britain, but there's another one that went back 5 years longer, and it said there was a net take, a net loss. So they're using the figures that they want, like they normally do. Typical politicians use the reports they want and not take any cash. But I'd also like to say that UKIP are not against immigration. We believe we need immigration. We cannot run this country without immigration. We accept that, and the UKIP policy is that we would have controlled immigration on a point-based system that would bring people in that we need for skills that we need. We don't need people here to fill shelves or to do normal jobs. Right. We need people, the doctors and nurses, engineers, etc. And that is what UKIP policy is.
Right.
And it's not portrayed because these leaders what they're doing.
Who was it shouting out there? Go on then, we'll just hear from you.
The only way UKIP can change anything is if they get MPs. How many MPs are you going to get at the next election? 5, 10 maybe? You're not going to get a majority to be able to change anything. I've spoken to the amount of MEPs. Do you know how many MEPs that UKIP have just elected that are already trying to stand at Parliament next year? It's about 30 to 35%. And why are they doing that? Because they can't do anything in the European Parliament. They want to come here, they want to become MPs in Parliament to change things. You're not going to get enough MPs to be able to change anything.
OK, Douglas Alexander.
Let me explain to you why I disagree with UKIP. Of course, youth unemployment in particular is a huge problem, not just in my community, but in the North East and right across the country. But we have to accept the fact that since the Berlin Wall came down, about 2 billion more workers have joined the global labour market. The only future for our young people in Britain is not to blame immigrants for taking jobs, but to open school books, to get skills, to get training, and to be able to compete in the global markets that we're going to face in the future. Right. And anybody who tells you that your son or your daughter is going to have a job if you stop immigrants is selling you a lie, when the reality is we're now competing with people in China, India, right around the world for economic talent and for economic success. And the way we're going to prosper is we're going to prosper together by raising our levels of skills and competing effectively in the international market.
Right. I want to move on to another question. Just before I do, there are a number of hands up, and I'd like to hear not from the panel, but from members of the audience. The person there on the left, the woman behind you, yes.
Yeah, hi, this is a question to Melanie.
No, just make a statement, if you would, because Melanie's had her fair say.
Well, basically, I think it's dangerous to start talking about different cultures. I think that infers biological difference, and it's a very dangerous line to walk. And, yeah, I think that's something that UKIP have done to proliferate their ideas, and I don't think it's beneficial in the discussion about immigration.
And you, sir, in the gangway, no, the man in the second row.
I fully agree that, like, diversity within society does add value, and I think rather than kind of stigmatise people who are coming into the country, really truly assess what value they do have to our society, what value are they going to bring, and how can we fully assess that so that the British society can fully benefit from people moving into the country. And also, I think what we need to consider as well is how we fully address immigrants coming into the country illegally, how we can fully address that side of it as well. So ethnic diversity is really important, but we've got to fully assess its value to our society.
OK. Thank you very much. I think we'll move on to another question. Thank you very much, everybody. Let me take this question now. From Robert Alexander, please.
In a country of 60 million people, is it that difficult to find someone suitably qualified to chair the child abuse inquiry?
Well, this is the... The Lord Mayor of London, Fiona Woolf, and Butler Sloss before stood down for various reasons, and there's still nobody chosen to chair this inquiry into abuse over a number of years. Douglas Alexander, why can't anybody be found to do it?
I think that's a question that we really need Theresa May to answer. I mean, first of all, she got herself into a position of endorsing somebody who it turns out was related to a government minister at the time that these alleged crimes were happening, you could put one chair of this committee down to carelessness. There was then a second chair appointed who it turned out had social connections and had been at the house of one of the people whose name has appeared in the newspapers in relation to many of these allegations. And in that sense, I think there is an overriding responsibility, an urgent responsibility on the government to get it right. Why? Not just because it's embarrassing for them 7 weeks on, but much, much more fundamentally for the victims of these crimes who want transparency, justice and answers. Frankly, they have waited too long. They deserve answers, and they will only have answers that they can trust if there is an independent chair of this inquiry who has integrity and independence that is beyond reproach. So, having balls this up twice, I sincerely hope, in the interests of those victims, the government now gets on with it and appoints an independent chair who will command the confidence not just of the victims, but of everybody across Britain.
Okay, Brandon Lewis.
I think absolutely. I think we have got the expertise in this country. I think we will be able to find the right person.
Why is it proving so difficult then?
Well, actually, I think in terms of the point the gentleman, I think Robert, who asked the question, made about somebody who's qualified. Actually, I think both the people who have taken the chair so far have been qualified. I don't think their qualifications to do the job are correct. But I also would say if you...
I said if they're not independent, they're not suitably qualified.
Well,
so they're not qualified.
Well, I think they both had the expertise.
An important qualification is independence, is independence of mind, and also to be seen to be independent.
Yeah, well, I think actually...
And we have to think about the victims.
You know, and I think absolutely that's the key issue. This is around making sure that we get to a position where victims can see that justice is done, and actually, as importantly, that this can never happen again, that institutions can never break down in this way again. Now, the panel is obviously already in place and has already been doing some work. He's meeting, and there's a forum indeed next week, and what Theresa May said this week in apologising for the situation we found ourselves in. I think there's a difference between whether somebody is qualified and can do a job impartially and is perceived to be impartial. That's a very fair point. And that's why Theresa May has said now for the new chairman, when they're appointed, she's going to consult not just with Yvette Cooper, but also with the chairman of the Select Committee. They will go through vetting with the Select Committee itself and to consult with victims as well. So we make sure we get somebody who is independent and has the confidence of victims. I think that is absolutely key.
Matt Forde.
This isn't just about government cock-ups and leaving laptops on trains and all the sort of natural ineptitude of government. The fact that this is an inquiry about the establishment protecting itself and then the establishment is appointing two people that it could reasonably perceived would then protect itself is one of the most ridiculous political dramas, one of the most needless political dramas I've ever witnessed. The only thing I would have to say is I don't know whether it's actually possible to meet someone or to appoint someone that's of the sort of qualification in the academic sense and in the career sense that actually hasn't met politicians or members of the establishment. I think we're actually going to have to appoint someone that at some point, a member of the judiciary, that has hobnobbed with cabinet ministers, because if they haven't, arguably they haven't been doing their job right in the first place.
Melanie Phillips.
I think Matt's entirely right. When you have an inquiry like this, you know, the establishment sets up the inquiry, it goes to a member of the establishment, and the establishment is quite small. They all either know each other, or are married to each other, or related to each other. And especially if you have to have a woman, because it's child abuse, well, women in public life tend to be people who have some involvement in children's charities and that whole world. So it's very hard to find someone who really is quite outside it. But I would make a different point. I think this inquiry is complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. Look at the terms of the inquiry. It's ridiculous. It basically is setting itself to inquire into the scandal of enabling and allowing these dreadful child abuse attacks and so forth over a large number of years, over the entire country, involving every agency involved in child protection, the police, the social services, the health service. It's impossible for any inquiry to discover anything that is significant that we don't know. We all know what the problem is. In child abuse cases, There has been inquiry after inquiry after inquiry, not child sexual abuse, but, you know, children being murdered and so forth and so on. And, you know, every time one of these things happens, one of these dreadful tragedies where the social services fell down and the police fell down and the health service fell down, and there's a serious inquiry and lots of people say serious things, and it's shelved, and then there's another terrible scandal and another terrible abuse and another inquiry.
So what do
no
you
one
do?
ever learns anything.
What do you do? Nothing.
What you do is you understand what's gone on here. There are two things, I think, that have gone on to create this situation. One is that in the administrative class, there's been allowed to develop a culture of impunity in which people of incompetence get away with it and basically are appointed to different jobs and get promoted. And there's something gone wrong in our whole way that we hold professionals accountable. That's the first thing. The second thing is that with these terrible child abuse cases, there is such hypocrisy here because we are in a society which for, I don't know, 2 decades, 3 decades, has winked at the sexualization of children. We've basically said children are entitled to have sexual relations. Look at what's going on in the schools. Give them sex education, give them abortion counselling. We basically, the whole
that doesn't
idea
absolve the paedophiles of the awful crimes they've committed.
What?
No. That doesn't absolve the abusers and the paedophiles.
Absolutely. It doesn't absolve them, but we have some responsibility. We've created a kind of paedophile society.
OK. The man up there in the second row from the back. Yes, you, sir.
We could quite easily solve the problem about the chairmanship because I have no confidence whatsoever in any establishment figures within London. It's just a city-state and it's just like a daisy chain. However, we do have similar judicial systems in Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and they could come over here. Some people could be chosen from there who don't have these links with Leon Britton and people like that, who could chair this inquiry properly, and some forthright speaking person could say, I'm sorry, but that's unacceptable. You need to tell me the truth.
Okay. Charles Kennedy.
Yeah. And it's, I think if I may say so, that last point is an extremely pertinent one. Look at Northern Ireland. We've taken in people from Canada of senior military rank to investigate certain things, to lay down recommendations. They've carried the confidence of that very divided, very difficult community, and they've carried the broader confidence internationally as well. So I think you're on a good point there. But, I mean, I'm feeling a bit nostalgic tonight in this programme. I mean, this is the second time I'm going to cite Mrs Thatcher, having never referred to her for decades on this programme. But she did say famously once that advisers advise, ministers decide. And what Douglas was saying a moment ago in the beginning of this discussion, I do find it bizarre how Theresa May arrived at both these decisions. And at the end of the day, the buck stops with the minister. But what on earth was Sir Humphrey doing, and several Sir Humphreys doing? They're supposed to be there as well to do all this sifting. They're supposed to know all these people. Now, the Home Secretary at the end of the day should also have the nous to say, wait a minute, but was this information not put in front of her? Did they not know about it? So, although the Minister takes the constitutional rap and responsibility, I do think the problem goes wider, and I think you're quite right. Whether it's international, I think the establishment is too small, particularly in legal circles, and I think it's too South East London-centric.
Okay.
And there's a lot of good legal minds right across the country that can be brought in as well.
Which leads us directly, we have 10 minutes left, to our last question, I think, from Charlotte. Is it Batch or Bash?
Beige.
Beige.
Yeah.
Charlotte. Anyway.
In the wake of Scotland's recent independence referendum, should there be an elective assembly for the North East region?
So Scotland had its independence referendum. Manchester this week got its mayor and £2 billion in his wake. And should the North East have an elected assembly, remembering that there was a vote on that here, which resoundingly rejected it a few years back. Brandon Lewis.
Well, I think actually the key, and taking your point, David, of what happened a few years back was somebody like me in a suit in Whitehall said this is what we're going to do to the North East. And I think that's entirely wrong. I think what should happen is what's happened with Manchester. I think Manchester is setting a really good trend in actually coming to government and saying this is what we think works for us. And if it's the North East, or if it's Newcastle or Leeds or any other independent individual city or other county in the country, comes to the government and says, look, this is what works for us. We want to grow our economy, we want to get the houses built we need, work with our local people, then I think we should be looking at that as government and supporting that. Actually, in the North East, the growth deal is actually bigger than the one in London at the moment that the government's put forward, nearly 300 million for the North East. Yeah. I think it'd be great to see that kind of thing happen, but I think it's got to be locally led, by local people and for local people, and that's what's absolutely key. And that's the big difference from what we're talking about in government to what the previous government tried to foist on people.
Do you agree with that, sir?
No, I don't, actually. The classic mistake he's already made is actually that he refers to the North East as Newcastle. Newcastle isn't the North East. We're all in the North East.
No, I'm not.
And Teesside gets left behind all the time. We are a conurbation of nearly 500,000 people, and we're living on the end of a branched railway line to Darlington with an airport that's got no aircraft in it. If you want to grow this area, fix that.
Let me just be very clear. I wasn't referring to the North East as Newcastle. What I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily need to be the North East as a region. It could be Newcastle as a city. I said as well, Leeds as a city, Middlesbrough. Individual areas can come forward, come to government with a bespoke package that's right for them to deliver growth and the right thing for their local communities. Okay. And then it's driven by local people. I think that's the key.
You said in the blue.
Yeah. This chap is correct. We already have a system, right? And it's okay, it's down in London, which is a bit of a long way off. But what we actually have is MPs. We have MPs in the area. We don't want councillors having to travel up to Newcastle or wherever the assembly would be, because that's the sort of thing that would happen. What we need is these MPs to get together, forget your party infights, etc., and between each other. You actually want to get together and fight for this region as a region, right? But not have the day-to-day running, because you've got your councils. Your councils actually do the day-to-day running of that area that they know. You want somebody to be able to talk about an area, know that street down there, they know where it is. They don't need to be taken to it, right? Absolutely. They don't need to refer to it on a map. They actually know it, right?
But you don't want. But do you or don't you want an elected assembly separate from the councillors?
No, your elected assembly is what we've already elected. Our MPs
right.
Get together.
Matt Forde.
I totally agree. I just think it's really easy to talk about localism and say, oh, we're going to put power in people's hands. Into which local people's hands? If you're doing it to local councillors, most of them get elected on a 30% turnout these days. I'm not sure they've got a mandate
and
to
even
spend our money.
He knows we don't trust,
locally.
Because in this very building, the party politics that go on in this building, we the people, we're the pawns in the game. We're the pawns.
Well, party politics is part of life. Game. That's not necessarily... Party politics isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I just think we talk about... I think Westminster talks about devolution because it thinks it's what the people want to hear. Actually, I don't think there's any great desire across this country for regional assemblies at all.
No, not at all.
Melanie.
Great.
Well, the Scotland referendum meant that the United Kingdom was kept together, and I think this trend towards more regionalisation is weakening it by the back door. First of all, you don't really want another tier of government, I would have thought. Manchester, 2 years ago, was it, voted against having an elected mayor. Suddenly, it's having an elected mayor thrust upon it by George Osborne for reasons which, at the moment, seem a little opaque. I mean, it's been said rather uncharitably that the purpose of giving or imposing an elected mayor on Manchester is that when, painful cuts have to be made, as they will in the years to come, then it's going to be the elected mayor that's going to take the rap rather than the central government. Far be it for me to be so cynical. But what I really worry about with all this regionalisation, it's the weakening of Parliament. You see, it comes back to our first question. Why have people lost trust in politicians? Part of the reason is because politicians have basically exported their power, and devolution is part of that. But if they are going to start setting up elected mayors, setting up regional assemblies, supposing these regional assemblies are led by parties or politicians who absolutely oppose what Westminster is doing. Now, you in the North East may say that's what we want, but in terms of a nation, keeping a nation together, it's a recipe for chaos. It's a recipe for weakening the nation, and I think that we need to be strengthening the nation, not weakening.
So it's OK for Scotland, but not for England, regionally, to do what Scotland has done?
Well, I took a very unfashionable view at the time, which may amaze you. that devolution for Scotland was not a sensible idea because it would actually exacerbate the move or the feeling for independence. And so it proved. And I don't think that story is over yet.
Douglas Alexander.
I think you have to start from the basic principle of democracy, and in that sense, if people in the North East want a different form of regional authority, that was put to people in the North East in previous years and it was comprehensively rejected, then that's something that will emerge again. My sense is that what happened in Manchester, albeit I understand George Osborne's motive, it was a rather desperate act, was actually the local authorities in Manchester got together in a combined authority when we were in power, when Labour was in power, and said, we can do certain basic things better in this city region than we can alone. That things like transport, things like skills to get young people into work, issues like housing. Now, in that sense, decentralisation does seem to me to hold out the prospect of more legitimacy in decision-making, but I don't think you can have a top-down, one-size-fits-all imposition from Westminster or from anywhere else. I think what we will see over the years ahead will be power flowing back to communities and to regions across the United Kingdom, but that has to be judged by the circumstances in those individual communities. I don't sense the North East, whether Teesside or Newcastle or anywhere else, wants George Osborne telling it what's good for it. I think those decisions are better taken here in this community.
The woman there, yes.
I think what people actually want in the North East is to be recognised. I mean, we're sort of below Scotland that we don't get the quirky benefits, and we're sort of above Manchester that we don't really get recognised. It's like we're in no man's land and just totally forgotten about. We never get mentioned on the national news. You know, events that happen up here never seem to get talked about.
But that's true of a lot of English regions, isn't it?
Charles Kennedy.
Coming back to the lady's initial question, I am strongly in favour of an elected assembly for the North East, and I think it could be a trailblazer regionally for the rest of England. And the reason I say that is partly the issue of democracy. If that's what people want, I came here and campaigned, in fact, shoulder to shoulder with one Tony Blair at the time. I was Lib Dem leader, he was Prime Minister. A fat lot of good it did us. Although people need to remember, as you might well recall, the Newcastle Journal had a poll at the very beginning of that campaign, which was showing something like 70-30 in favour of the principle of a North East Assembly. Several months of John Prescott's hands-on management, and we got a result that was exactly the opposite. But the other point is this. You've got to recognise democracy, of course. I would say this to Melanie, who's concerned about the United Kingdom. Strong leadership. Mrs Thatcher was certainly a strong leader. If Mrs Thatcher had persisted and remained in power, that's the third and final reference, had she remained in power, she was the godmother of modern Scottish nationalism, and if she'd carried on the way she was going and she'd not left office, you wouldn't have a United Kingdom today, and that's Mrs Thatcher you would have to thank.
Well, I'm not quite sure what that's got to do with an assembly for the North East, but anyway.
You've got to recognise the democratic impulse.
Brandon Lewis, very briefly, if you would speak.
I was just going to say, I came to the North East to launch the growth deal, which, as I say, was actually bigger than the growth deal for London. It was nearly £300 million. And I think the real key here is, as some members of the audience have said, there should not be another layer of bureaucracy in government. None of us want to see that. We have got locally elected councillors. They're coming together in combined authorities, working together in a good way. I took 4 of those through in legislation just earlier this year. And I think the real key, and again, really important difference between our party, the Conservative Party and Labour is I don't believe anybody in a Whitehall suit should be telling any area of the country what to do. It's got to be locally driven and bespoke to suit that particular area. Whether it's a city, a county or a town, it's about what people in those areas want. We've got to react to that and deliver for those people.
OK. We have to stop. Thank you very much. Sorry to those who've got your hands up still, but our hour's up. We're going to be in Cardiff next week. First Minister of Wales, Carwyn Jones, the columnist Rod Liddle, among those on the panel. The week after that, we're going to be in Birmingham, and the way to apply, as ever, is to go to our website, which is on the screen there. And I'm afraid last week this website collapsed, but it's up working again now. So I'm grateful to all of you who managed to get here, actually, because of that. But anyway, it's now up working again, and you can either go to the website or to 0330 123 9988. If you've been listening on 5 Live, as you know, the debate goes on Question Time, Extra Time. My thanks to our panel, to all of you who came here to take part in the programme from Middlesbrough. Until next Thursday, good night.
David Mitchell on overreacting, and a roundup of the political week by Adam Bolton. This week follows next here on BBC One.
Welcome, Len and Lucy.
Len's wiggling his hips.
Never. As they dive deep into dance history.
Pope denounces new paganism.
The tango.
Twerking. Nothing new.
Yeah.